He came to a small town for a quiet visit, but what he found inside the dojo would change everything. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The mornings where John Cena lived were nothing like the roaring arenas or the flashing lights he had known for most of his career. Here, in the quiet outskirts far from crowded cities, the day began in soft layers, the sun lifting slowly over the tree line, the cool air carrying the scent of grass still damp with dew. John had grown used to this rhythm. His mornings were steady, predictable, a grounding contrast to the chaos of his years on the road. He rose before the sun out of habit, pulling on worn training gear and stepping outside into the cool stillness. The gravel under his boots crunched softly as he crossed the yard, his breath visible in the crisp air. A small home gym stood a few paces from his back porch, nothing flashy, just enough equipment to keep his body in peak form. The clang of weights, the thud of a heavy bag, and the measured sound of his own breathing filled the space as he moved through his routine. Years of discipline had built these habits into him so deeply that training now felt as natural as breathing. By mid-morning, his workout was done, and he often took a slow walk around the property, letting the quiet settle into him before returning to the house for breakfast. It was a life stripped down to the essentials, and he valued it. It was just before noon when the phone rang, cutting into the quiet hum of his thoughts. He picked it up, and the voice on the other end was instantly familiar. Daniel Price, an old friend from his early wrestling days and later a partner in several community outreach programs. They hadn't spoken in months, but the warmth in Daniel's tone hadn't faded. They exchanged a few words of small talk before Daniel got to the point. He told John about a small city 2 states away where he had been volunteering at a local martial arts center. The program there was important to the community, especially the kids, and they were hosting a public exhibition in a week. Local officials, parents, and sponsors would be in attendance. Daniel said it was meant to be a celebration, a way to show the good the academy was doing. But there was a pause in his voice when he mentioned the head instructor, a man named Vince Gage. Daniel didn't speak badly of him outright, but his careful choice of words made John listen more closely. Vince was, he said, a decorated martial artist with a knack for winning attention. His face was on every banner in town, every flyer, every ad for the academy. The place had grown a lot under his leadership. But Daniel's hesitations hinted that there was more to the story. He didn't say exactly what, only that it would mean a lot if John came to watch. He didn't need to perform or take part, just be there, lend some weight to the event, and maybe inspire the younger students. John leaned against the counter, looking out the window at the line of trees swaying in the light wind. He valued his solitude and didn't leave it behind lightly. But Daniel was more than a friend. He was someone who only called with real purpose. That alone was enough. He told Daniel he'd be there. The decision was simple, even if he didn't yet know what awaited him. The week passed quickly. John made arrangements for someone to watch the property, packed light, just a duffel with clothes, a pair of sneakers, and a few essentials, and set out on the drive. The road carried him through open stretches of countryside, past fields and small towns where the pace of life was slower. As the hours passed, the landscape shifted, and by late afternoon, he was pulling into the small city. Main Street looked like it hadn't changed in decades. An old diner with a neon sign, a hardware store with peeling paint on the trim, but as he drove deeper, signs of the event began to appear. Banners stretched across intersections, posters filled shop windows, all showing the same man in a sharp black martial arts uniform. Vince Gage stared out from them with a confident, almost challenging look, slogans promising strength and excellence beneath his image. When John reached the academy, it was impossible to miss. It occupied a corner building with tall glass windows that revealed the matted floors inside. Above the doors, bold letters announced it as the Gage Academy of Martial Excellence. Outside, parents waited with children in white uniforms. Teenagers chatted near the wall, and a few men in tracksuits leaned against the glass. The building was clean and impressive, but the atmosphere was not warm. The conversations outside were quiet, the posture of the students unnaturally stiff. John stayed back observing before heading to the small hotel where he had booked a room. The morning of the exhibition arrived under a pale, cloudy sky. John ate breakfast at the hotel, then walked the short distance to the academy. The glass doors loomed above him as he stepped inside. The mats were arranged in perfect rows, their blue color sharp against the polished white walls. Mirrors lined one side, trophy cases the other, each one filled to overflowing with medals and gleaming cups. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant. A young woman in a branded tracksuit moved briskly between the crowd and the front desk, handing out visitor passes. John stood off to the side, taking in the details, the flow of people, the way parents asked questions in hushed tones. Then Vince appeared. He stepped through a side door, wearing a black GE with red trim, his belt heavy with stripes. He moved with confidence, greeting people, adjusting a student's stance here, shaking a parent's hand there. On the surface, he was all professionalism, but there was something in the tilt of his chin, in the measured way he looked at each person, that spoke of control more than welcome. John stayed quiet, content to watch as the event began. Students lined up in neat rows, bowing sharply at Vince's command. The movements were crisp, almost military. Vince spoke to the audience, his voice polished, talking about discipline and respect. The first demonstrations began, young children performing basic moves, older students sparring. Vince corrected mistakes as they went, sometimes with a light touch, sometimes with a firm repositioning that left the child blinking. The applause that followed each set seemed more for him than for the students. And then it happened. Vince's gaze drifted across the audience and landed on John. His eyes lingered, curiosity and calculation flickering there. After the next applause, Vince stepped forward, speaking of the importance of realism in training. He said that sometimes you needed a fresh partner to make a point, and he gestured toward John. The crowd turned, murmuring, their eyes following as John stood and walked to the mat. Vince greeted him with a firm handshake, introducing him as a visiting guest. His tone carried a note that only John picked up, a test, not just a demonstration. Vince explained that he would show a standard self-defense move for being grabbed from behind. His voice made it sound harmless, but his eyes said otherwise. The room grew quiet as he stepped behind John. Years of experience told John this was not going to be a simple display. He steadied his breathing, feeling the weight of the moment settle. Whatever Vince's intentions, this was only the beginning. John woke early the next day, the overcast light slipping through the thin curtains of his hotel room. The quiet hum of the small city outside was different from the stillness back home, softer, yet carrying a pulse of movement even at this early hour. He sat at the small desk by the window for a while, watching delivery trucks pass and pedestrians hurrying to work, letting his thoughts drift back to the previous day's exhibition. The moment Vince Gage had singled him out was still fresh in his mind. not as a moment of pride, but as a sign. There had been something deliberate in Vince's choice, something about testing him in front of an audience. And yet it was what John had seen beyond the chokehold that kept him thinking. The stiffness in the students, the measured fear in their movements, the way parents looked on without smiling. After breakfast, John decided to walk back to the academy, this time with no crowd to mask the true atmosphere. The streets were quieter than they had been during the event. When he reached the building, the tall glass windows gave him a clear view inside. The bright mats looked the same, but now they were scattered with smaller groups of students. A younger instructor, wearing a white jai and a brown belt, was leading drills while Vince was nowhere in sight. The students moved in unison, their stances precise but lacking energy. John stepped inside, greeting the receptionist with a polite nod. She hesitated for just a fraction of a second before returning the gesture, as though she recognized him from the day before but wasn't sure how to respond. The brown belt instructor's voice carried across the mats, firm, but without the charisma Vince displayed. Even so, there was no warmth. Commands were short and mechanical. When a boy of about 12 missed a step in a combination, the instructor stopped the group, told him to repeat it, and made him perform the move again and again until his shoulders sagged and his breath came in shallow bursts. The boy's eyes stayed on the floor, and none of the other students dared to look at him. John remained at the edge, watching carefully. He had been in countless gyms and dojos over the years, and he knew discipline was essential. But what he saw here was different. There was no encouragement, no moment of release, no sign that the training was building confidence along with skill. It was control without balance. When the class ended, John stepped outside into the cool air, letting the door close quietly behind him. He was about to head back toward the hotel when he noticed an older man approaching from across the street. The man wore a faded baseball cap and walked with the gait of someone accustomed to hard work. His eyes shifted toward the academy before settling on John. He introduced himself in a low voice as the father of one of the students. He said he had seen what happened between John and Vince during the exhibition. His tone was careful, and he glanced around before continuing, explaining that his son had once loved martial arts, but lately dreaded going to class. There had been no visible injuries, but his boy had become withdrawn, quieter, and tense before each session. John listened without interrupting. The man's words matched the unease John had already felt in the room. Before leaving, the father suggested John speak with a few other parents who shared his concerns. There was a pause before he added that people here didn't talk openly about Vince. He had influence, friends in the right places, and those who crossed him often found themselves on the outside of community circles. Then he tipped his cap and walked away, leaving John with more questions than answers. Over the next 2 days, John returned to the academy quietly, blending into the background as much as possible. He sat through classes led by Vince and by his assistants, noting the way students were singled out for extended drills, the way praise was rare and often tinged with condescension. He noticed how parents lingered in the lobby or near the entrance, not chatting casually, but watching with an edge of unease as though wanting to be close in case something went wrong. Vince's corrections were technically sound but carried a sharpness that pushed past instruction into intimidation. It was subtle at times, overt at others, but it always carried the same weight, a reminder of who was in control. John also noticed the behavior of the assistant instructors. They deferred to Vince in a way that went beyond professional respect. They copied his tone, his mannerisms, even his impatience. None of them seemed willing to adjust a drill or soften an order without his approval. The culture inside the academy was built on Vince's approach, and no one seemed inclined to challenge it. Late one afternoon, John met with Daniel in a quiet corner booth of a small diner. The smell of coffee and fried food hung in the air. The red vinyl of the seats cracked with age. Daniel's expression was serious from the moment John sat down. He admitted that he hadn't told John everything before the exhibition because he'd hoped the event might pass without conflict. But seeing Vince hold that choke longer than necessary had erased that hope. Daniel lowered his voice, explaining that Vince's influence extended beyond the mats. The Academy's success in regional tournaments and its community programs for at-risk youth had earned him strong allies among local officials. On paper, the programs looked admirable. Free classes for underprivileged kids, guidance away from trouble, but Daniel had heard whispers that the reality was far less noble. John absorbed every word, his eyes fixed on Daniel as the pieces began to fall into place. This wasn't just about a strict instructor. It was about a man who used his position to maintain control over his students, their parents, and perhaps even parts of the community itself. Challenging that kind of authority would take more than skill on the mat. It would take proof, and proof would not come easily. As the light outside the diner windows dimmed, John knew his role in this town was no longer that of a guest. Whether Vince saw him as a threat yet or not, he intended to see exactly what kind of power was being exercised inside those walls, and what it was doing to the people who walked through them. The morning of the public seminar arrived with a clear sky, the sun spilling a soft gold over the town as John made his way to the recreation center. He had been in enough arenas to recognize the kind of energy that built before an event like this. Parents corralling their kids, students in freshly pressed uniforms warming up, officials mingling near the entrance to be seen. The building itself was larger than the academy, a multi-purpose space with rows of folding chairs set up around a wide matted area in the center. The scent of new vinyl mats mixed with the faint aroma of coffee from a refreshment table near the back. John found a seat near the front but slightly off to the side, where he could watch without being the center of attention. The room buzzed with anticipation as people took their seats, cameras and phones ready. Vince Gage moved easily through the crowd, dressed in his black G with red trim, the same commanding presence he'd shown at the exhibition. He smiled for photos, shook hands, and radiated an ease that seemed designed to reassure his supporters and subtly remind everyone who controlled the stage. When the seminar began, Vince took the microphone with the practiced cadence of someone used to holding an audience. He spoke about discipline, community, and the importance of resilience, weaving in stories of the Academy's successes. The first demonstrations were tightly rehearsed, young students showing basic sequences, older ones moving into more complex sparring drills. Each set ended with applause, the rhythm of the event smooth and uninterrupted. John sat quietly, watching not just the techniques but the way the students reacted to Vince's presence, the slight tightening of shoulders when he passed, the quick corrections that snapped into place at his command. Then the shift came. Vince's eyes swept over the crowd, pausing when they landed on John. His smile tightened almost imperceptibly before he spoke into the microphone. "Mr. Cena," he said, his tone carrying an edge hidden beneath a veneer of warmth. "Perhaps you'd join us on the mat. I think everyone here would enjoy seeing you in action." The audience murmured, turning to look at John. He stood without hurry, his expression calm, and stepped onto the mat. Vince greeted him with a handshake, the grip just firm enough to hint at competition. "We'll go through some holds and escapes," Vince explained for the crowd. "Mr. Cena will react as he sees fit." The words sounded casual, but John caught the flicker of intent in his eyes. The first few techniques were harmless: wrist locks, shoulder grabs, each met with smooth, controlled counters from John. Vince smiled, but each time his hold lingered a fraction longer than necessary, his grip just a bit tighter, as though testing the boundaries. The crowd responded with polite applause, but John could hear the faint shift in tone, a mix of curiosity and expectation. Then Vince moved in for the chokehold, the same one from the exhibition, this time with a fraction more force. The crook of his arm locked around John's neck, the pressure precise and deliberate. John let it settle for a single heartbeat, feeling the crowd's attention tighten before shifting his weight just enough to trap Vince's arm, stepping through the hold with practiced efficiency. The reversal was flawless. Vince found himself on the mat, immobilized, John's control absolute but without aggression. The silence that followed was heavier than applause. Parents leaned forward, students exchanged quick glances. Vince's face was composed, but the stiffness in his movements betrayed the effort it took to mask the frustration. John released him at once and stepped back, giving him space to recover. He didn't speak, didn't make a show of it. The message was in the control, in the fact that the hold had been broken decisively without malice. The seminar resumed, but the rhythm was off. Vince's instructions were sharper, his tone less fluid. John could feel the shift in the room, parents watching more closely, students sneaking glances at him between drills. The seed had been planted. When the demonstrations ended, John stepped off the mat and back into the crowd, the air thick with the unspoken acknowledgement of what had just happened. As people began to leave, two parents approached him near the doors. Their voices were quiet, almost cautious, but urgent. They said they had seen enough and wanted to help. John met their gaze, recognizing the moment for what it was. The first crack in Vince Gage's control. He nodded once, the beginning of a plan already forming in his mind as they stepped out into the late afternoon light. The following morning, John met the two parents who had approached him outside the recreation center. They had chosen a small cafe on the edge of town, a place with worn wooden floors and a constant low hum from the coffee grinder. It was early enough that only a few other customers sat scattered at tables. The parents spoke in hushed voices, introducing themselves by first name only. Both had children who trained under Vince Gage, and both had noticed changes over the past year, changes they couldn't ignore anymore. One described how her son, once confident and eager, had become withdrawn, tense before every class, and reluctant to talk about training at home. The other said her daughter had started waking up in the middle of the night after sparring days, silent but shaken, and refusing to explain what had happened. John listened closely, asking only enough questions to clarify details. They told him Vince had a way of making parents feel like doubting him meant they didn't want the best for their children. He framed criticism as ignorance and painted his harshest methods as a mark of commitment. Even when students came home sore or shaken, parents often convinced themselves it was simply part of building resilience. But these two weren't convinced anymore. They believed what they had seen from John at the seminar, the calm, the control, the refusal to play by Vince's rules, had been the first time their kids looked at an adult on the mat and saw someone who didn't frighten them. After the meeting, John began spending more time quietly observing the academy. He would walk past during evening classes, sometimes stopping just long enough to watch through the tall glass windows. On other days, he'd step inside and sit on one of the benches along the wall, offering a nod to the receptionist, but otherwise staying silent. Vince rarely acknowledged him, but John could feel the man's awareness like a steady weight in the room. The assistant instructors carried on as usual, pushing drills with relentless repetition. When a student faltered, they were singled out in front of the others, sometimes for the remainder of the session. The corrections were not violent, but they were unyielding, and the eyes of the students told John that the line between discipline and punishment had been crossed long ago. Late one afternoon, as the last class of the day ended, a father approached John in the parking lot. He looked around before speaking, his voice low. He said he had tried to talk to Vince about his concerns, only to be told that his son lacked the mental toughness to succeed. That phrase stuck with John. It was the same kind of language he'd heard in locker rooms and training camps used to justify pushing someone past what was reasonable. The man admitted he'd been avoiding confrontation because Vince's connections in the community made him seem untouchable. But seeing John stand his ground during the seminar had made him think twice about staying quiet. Over the next few days, John's presence in town became familiar enough that parents began approaching him more often. Some came up to him in grocery store aisles, others in the parking lot after dropping off their kids. A few even left notes at the hotel desk with times and places to meet. Each conversation added another piece to the picture forming in his mind. There were no dramatic stories of broken bones or hospital trips. Vince was too careful for that, but there was a clear and consistent pattern. Fear as a teaching tool, control as the foundation of every interaction, and a culture where questioning the instructor was unthinkable. One evening, John met Daniel at the same diner where they had spoken before. The light from the neon sign flickered across the table as Daniel slid into the booth. He looked tired, but more resolved than before. He told John he'd been hearing similar whispers for months, but had struggled to get anyone to speak openly. Vince's reputation in town was complicated. He was seen as a community leader, someone who kept kids on the right path, and that image had protected him from scrutiny. Daniel admitted that when he'd first called John, he'd hoped just having him present would remind Vince of accountability. But now, after the seminar, it was clear that Vince saw John as a challenge, maybe even a threat. John leaned back, folding his arms as he considered the situation. The picture was clearer now, but so was the risk. If Vince felt his control slipping, he might become even more aggressive, not just toward students, but toward anyone he thought was undermining him. Still, John knew from experience that exposing this kind of authority required precision. It wasn't enough to stand up to a man like Vince on the mat. You had to give the people around him the courage to see him for what he truly was. And that meant taking the first step toward building something Vince couldn't control. As the two men left the diner, the night air was cool and sharp, the street lamps casting long shadows on the pavement. John could feel the tension in the town, not visible to a casual passerby, but present in the guarded glances and careful words of those who had started to trust him. The challenge ahead was no longer just about confronting Vince Gage in his own arena. It was about dismantling the hold he had over people who didn't even realize how deep it ran. The town's recreation center was buzzing with activity when John arrived on the day of the community seminar. The event had been promoted all week, and the crowd reflected it. Rows of folding chairs already half filled with parents and children, local officials in casual suits standing near the entrance, and a cluster of reporters from the local paper setting up their cameras. A broad matted area dominated the center of the hall, freshly cleaned and marked for demonstrations. The air was charged, a hum of anticipation running through it as people took their seats. John moved quietly toward a spot in the front row, not trying to hide, but not inviting unnecessary attention either. From his seat, he could see nearly the entire floor. Students in crisp uniforms lined the sides of the mat, stretching under the watchful eyes of assistant instructors. Their movements were sharp, precise, but the tension in their posture was unmistakable. Vince Gage entered a few minutes later, dressed in his black tie with red trim, the same belt heavy with stripes he'd worn at the exhibition. His walk was measured, every step calculated to project authority. He greeted people warmly, shook hands with the mayor, posed for photos with children, but when his eyes swept the room and locked briefly on John, the faintest trace of something colder passed across his face before the smile returned. The seminar began with Vince speaking into a microphone, his voice steady and practiced. He talked about the Academy's achievements, the importance of discipline, and the role martial arts played in building character. The first demonstrations were fast and polished. Pairs of older students sparring under strict control, younger ones showing choreographed sequences. The crowd clapped in all the right places, their attention focused on Vince's running commentary as much as on the students themselves. When the final pair of students bowed and stepped to the side, Vince's gaze began moving across the audience again. It stopped on John. The pause was brief but deliberate. "Mr. Cena," Vince said, his tone smooth but carrying an undercurrent of challenge. "Perhaps you'd be willing to join us on the mat for a demonstration. I'm sure everyone here would be excited to see you in action." There was a ripple of murmurs in the crowd as heads turned. John rose without hesitation and walked toward the center of the mat. Vince met him with a handshake, firm, measured, and just tight enough to hint at rivalry. Addressing the crowd, Vince explained that they would go through a series of holds and escapes, with John reacting as he saw fit. The first few were simple: a wrist grab, a basic arm lock. John moved through each with quiet efficiency, countering cleanly without force. Vince smiled, offering light explanations to the audience, but John could feel the subtle increase in pressure with each new hold. By the fourth technique, Vince's grip had grown noticeably tighter, his movements sharper. The change wasn't visible to the untrained eye, but John could read it as clearly as a headline. Vince was trying to reassert control. Finally, Vince stepped in behind him for a chokehold, the same one he had used at the exhibition, but this time with more force. The crook of his arm locked around John's neck, pulling tight with a precision meant to make the escape difficult. John let the hold settle for a heartbeat, enough for the audience to see it clearly, before shifting his weight and trapping Vince's arm. With one smooth movement, he stepped through and used controlled leverage to bring Vince down to the mat. The reversal was quick, decisive, and left Vince immobilized without injury. The crowd's reaction was immediate, though subdued. An audible intake of breath from the front rows, parents leaning forward in their seats, students whispering to one another. Vince's face remained composed as John released him and stepped back, but the tightness around his eyes betrayed the effort it took to stand without hesitation. John didn't speak. The demonstration was over, and the message was clear without words. The rest of the seminar carried on, but the energy in the room had shifted. Vince's instructions were shorter, his tone less fluid. Parents were watching more intently now, and some of the students' eyes darted toward John, as if measuring him against the man they'd always been told was unshakable. When the event ended, people began filtering toward the exits. Near the doorway, two parents approached John, their voices low but urgent. They said they had seen enough, and they wanted to help. John met their eyes and nodded. This was the start of something larger than a public demonstration. It was the first visible crack in the image Vince Gage had built, and now it was time to widen it. The day after the seminar, John met with the two parents again, this time in a quiet room above a hardware store on the far side of town. It was a small space with wood-paneled walls and a single long table surrounded by mismatched chairs. The blinds were drawn, letting in only thin strips of daylight. One by one, more parents arrived, some carrying folders or small envelopes, others with nothing but tense expressions. A few former students, now in their late teens or early 20s, slipped in quietly and took seats at the edges of the room. No one spoke at first. The air was heavy with caution. John opened the meeting by introducing himself properly to those who hadn't spoken with him yet, making it clear he wasn't there to run anyone's fight for them, but to help them take it on together. Once the first parent began to speak, the rest followed in a slow but steady wave. Stories emerged about training sessions that pushed kids past exhaustion, about students being singled out for mistakes and made examples of in front of the class, about the way Vince's praise was rare and always conditional. One former student described the feeling of being kept on edge every time they stepped onto the mat, knowing that if they questioned a method, they would be used as the subject of an aggressive demonstration. Several parents had physical evidence, text messages from assistant instructors telling their children to toughen up or quit, schedules showing training blocks twice as long as promised, even short video clips recorded discreetly on phones. In one video, Vince could be seen holding a boy in a choke for several seconds after the child tapped, releasing only when the assistant instructor stepped closer. The boy stood up, rubbing his neck, while Vince laughed and made a remark the microphone on the camera didn't fully catch. The grainy footage didn't capture every detail, but it was enough to show a pattern of behavior that matched the stories being told in the room. As the accounts continued, John took careful notes. He didn't interrupt except to clarify dates or names. The more they spoke, the more the tone in the room shifted from hesitation to a quiet determination. People began to see they weren't alone, that their experiences weren't isolated incidents, but part of a larger, consistent problem. The idea of confronting Vince directly was still intimidating to many, but with each shared account, the group's resolve deepened. When the last story was told, John outlined the next step, the upcoming town council meeting in 3 days. He explained that Vince's academy received public funding through a youth outreach budget, and that the council prided itself on transparency. If they could present their accounts and evidence in front of council members, parents, students, and local reporters, Vince would be forced to respond in a form he didn't control. John offered to speak first, to set the tone and establish what he had personally witnessed. Then, one by one, the parents and former students willing to go on record would follow, supported by the evidence they had brought. Some were nervous at the thought of speaking publicly, but others began volunteering without prompting. One mother suggested contacting a journalist she knew in a neighboring city, arguing that outside attention would make it harder for the council to sweep the matter aside. Another offered to reach out to parents who had been reluctant to attend the meeting, hoping that the growing momentum would give them courage. By the time the group broke for the evening, a plan had taken shape. Everyone in the room understood the risks. Vince had influence and there would be backlash, but they also understood the opportunity. For years, many of them had endured his methods in silence. Now, they had a chance to speak together. As the parents and former students filed out, John stayed behind, gathering his notes and reviewing the evidence one more time. The grainy videos, the message logs, the training schedules, they were pieces of a puzzle that painted a clear picture when put together. He knew that when the council meeting came, it wouldn't be about one man's word against another's. It would be about the truth laid bare for all to see. When he finally stepped out into the night, the air was cool and still. The streets were mostly empty, the glow from street lamps casting long shadows on the pavement. John walked back toward his hotel with the weight of the coming days pressing on him, but also with a sense of direction. The fight ahead wouldn't happen in a ring or on a mat. It would happen in front of an audience that Vince could not intimidate, and in that space, skill and showmanship wouldn't be enough to protect him. The groundwork was set. Now, all that remained was to see it through. The night of the town council meeting arrived with a chill in the air, the kind that made people draw their coats tighter as they stepped out of their cars. John walked toward the small government building, its brick facade lit by 2 tall lamps at the entrance. From halfway down the block, he could already see the crowd. Parents gathered in groups, students in jackets over their uniforms, a few reporters balancing notepads and cameras. The air buzzed with low conversation, an undercurrent of nerves and anticipation. Inside, the council chamber was already at capacity. Rows of wooden benches and folding chairs were packed shoulder to shoulder, with people lining the walls and filling the back of the room. The council members sat at a long table at the front, their microphones already live. Vince Gage was there too, seated to one side in a dark suit, his expression composed, his posture perfect. He stood now and then to shake, hands with familiar faces, his smile never wavering, though John could see the flicker of calculation in his eyes as he scanned the room. When the meeting began, routine agenda items moved quickly, the crowd waiting for the item that had drawn them all here. When the chair announced the discussion of the youth outreach program's funding, the room seemed to tighten. John's name was called first. He stood, walked to the podium, and adjusted the microphone. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. In a steady tone, he recounted what he had seen since arriving in town. The exhibition where Vince's chokehold had gone beyond instruction, the seminar where the same hold was repeated with unnecessary force, the atmosphere of fear in irregular classes, the way students were corrected not to improve them, but to control them. He spoke of the parents who had approached him, their concerns for their children's well-being, and the patterns he had observed. He made no personal attacks, only statements of fact, each detail carefully chosen. When John stepped back, the first parent walked to the podium. Her voice trembled at first but steadied as she spoke about her son's dread before each class, about his reluctance to share what happened inside the academy. Another followed, then another, each account different in detail but identical in tone. Exhaustion, intimidation, a loss of joy in training. Then the evidence began. One of the parents played a short video on the projector, a grainy recording, but clear enough to show Vince holding a student in a choke long after the boy tapped. The sound of the boy gasping was audible in the room. Another clip showed a girl being yanked repeatedly by the collar during a sparring drill while Vince made a remark that drew uncomfortable laughter from the class. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience. When it was his turn to respond, Vince rose slowly, adjusting his tie before taking the microphone. His tone was smooth, almost paternal as he spoke of discipline, tradition, and the demands of competitive training. He framed the videos as moments taken out of context, insisted that his students' success in tournaments spoke for his methods. But, as he spoke, the weight of the testimonies hung over the room. Each polished phrase seemed to fall flat against the images and voices that had come before. The turning point came when a young man in his late teens stood from the back of the room without being called. His voice was strong and steady as he introduced himself as a former student who had left the academy after an injury Vince dismissed as weakness. He looked directly at the council as he said, "He teaches fear, not respect." The words landed like a blow. The room went silent. The chairwoman of the council spoke next, her tone firm. She announced that effective immediately, all funding to Vince Gage's youth programs would be suspended pending a full investigation. A low ripple of relief moved through the crowd, parents exchanging glances, some nodding quietly. Vince's expression hardened, though he kept his composure as he gathered his papers and left the room without another word. The crowd parted silently to let him pass. In the weeks that followed, the investigation deepened. More former students came forward, some from years past, adding their accounts to the record. Without funding and facing mounting scrutiny, Vince's academy closed its doors within a month. The building's windows went dark, the sign above the entrance taken down. John stayed in town just long enough to attend the opening session of a new community dojo. It was nothing fancy, a rented gym space with mats laid out in a wide circle, but the mood was light, the students laughing as they stumbled through warm-up drills. Parents lined the walls, watching without the tension that had once been so easy to spot. Daniel was there, smiling as he led the group, his voice encouraging, his corrections gentle but clear. When class ended, Daniel walked over and asked, "You're sticking around, right?" John looked at the mats, at the kids already talking about coming back next week, and shook his head with a small smile. "Not this time," he said. "You got this." He stepped outside into the cool evening air. The street was quiet, the last traces of daylight fading over the rooftops. As he walked away, he knew this fight had never been about overpowering someone in a hold. It had been about showing the truth, giving people the courage to stand together, and breaking the grip of fear. And in that, the win belonged to the whole town. The truth came out, and nothing would be the same again. Subscribe for more stories and share this video with your friends.